Okay, so what I want to talk about tonight is capitalism, crisis, and Occupy economics. And this is coming out of, as Therese mentioned, this is a teach-in organized by the Education Committee of Occupy Denver. And what we are doing, the purpose of these is to educate ourselves in the movement and educate others either about the movement or about the issues that the movement is committed to. Thinking about economics and how we talk about economics, and then I wanted to talk about what is capitalism, what is class, how do they affect us, and what are some of the important issues that both created the Occupy movement and that the Occupy movement is in a sense facing. So this part I'd like to actually read. So if you have the handout, it's what is Occupy economics? And I write that by Occupy economics or Occupy economic theory, I mean a particular way of thinking or theorizing which differs from mainstream economic theory in at least 4 ways. The first is the scope of inquiry reaches beyond the current capitalist system, so the entire system can be subject to critique and alternatives can be considered. This is, I call this the radical part because it goes to the root of talking about what capitalism is in a way that we can, in a sense, extract ourselves and assess capitalism as a system, right? Rather than just talking about reforming different parts of the system. The second point is the scope of inquiry includes both historical and social variables, so it takes into consideration not just how things are, but how they came to be, and what social forces, conflicts, and interests inform the constitution of present conditions. These include the forms of intersectionality of identity and oppression related to race, gender, class, sexuality, residency status. This I'm calling interdisciplinary or intersectionalist. The third point is it examines the role of power and ideology as well as subject and group formation. Subjects, ideologies, and systems are not separate and distinct, but rather co-constitutive and mutually informing. We are not just separate individual subjects or individual people that are within a system that's external to us. Being in a system is in part what makes us a subject or makes us a person, right? Our ideas, our concepts, our way of thinking is in part constituted by the systems that we inhabit. And us doing certain practices, repeating things, passing laws, making rules, create the institutions. So the dialectical part is that we have a back and forth between the constitution of the individual in the system and the individuals constituting the system. And this is very different than mainstream economic thought. And then the fourth point is the emancipatory part, and that's very different than the mainstream part. The goal of Occupy economics is emancipatory or liberatory insofar as the theory and analysis it provides is intended to inform social struggles and movements acting to change present conditions. That is to say, its purpose is to serve the movement with a robust analysis of our present condition and the forces that shaped it, as well as to identify concrete possibilities for emancipatory change and to identify the forces that oppose it. There are always forces that oppose it. So this is probably the most radically different kind of economic theory. So how did Occupy come about? Well, that's a really big question. One of the reasons that Occupy came about, the Occupy movement formed, is because there was a crisis in capitalism, and then there was a legitimation crisis on the part of the state. And that's why we can think about the lag time between the initial crisis that started to form in 2007, 2008, right? Subprime mortgage crisis, stock market falls, circulation of capital slows, there's mass panic. But then the Occupy movement started not that long ago, right? What was the lag time? I would venture to guess that the lag time is the legitimation crisis. The idea, it, in a sense, collectively dawned upon us, by us I mean the majority of people in this country, that there wasn't a political solution to the economic crisis. And once we realized that, collectively we realized that there was not the technocrats were not just going to go and fix everything, right? And in fact, the technocrats looked exactly like the people who were on Wall Street doing this stuff. There was a crisis. And it's not that it just started just at that moment. I mean, you can look at the last decade. It started with Gore v. Bush, the Supreme Court intervening in a presidential election. And that decade ended with Citizens United, which both of those undermine the idea of representational government in radically different ways, but they both do it. And there is a collective loss of confidence and trust in a political system with those, right? That just to take the judiciary, for example. We all know about corrupt politicians and money in politics and all that. So what I'm saying is that there was first an economic crisis, a crisis in capitalism, and it's because capitalism is global, it didn't just happen here, it happened everywhere, right? And then there was a legitimation crisis on the part of the state. The state was not able to solve the problems of capitalism. We get social movements in those contexts, right? Okay, now how they develop and what form they take depends on the area, domestic politics. We all know, the so-called Arab Spring. We have people's movements and political revolutions happening around the world, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. So that obviously influenced people. If you were paying attention to Madison, Wisconsin, when the unions, because the unions are still fairly strong there, organized mass protests that grew into coalition protests that occupied the Capitol in Wisconsin. That was inspirational. I remember everyone, I bought my AFL-CIO red Wisconsin shirts, and I walked around Denver saying, I'm from Wisconsin, fuck Scott Walker. I was so proud of Wisconsin. That matters. That's inspirational, right? And you saw how they organized and they did coalition work, and you had Egypt, you had Tunisia, et cetera, et cetera. It was inspirational. So you have capitalist crisis, legitimation crisis, and you have inspirational social movements, and then you get Occupy, right? And what I would say is that the Occupy movement isn't just a critique, it isn't just an expression of discontent. The Occupy movement is a political movement that has an internal structure that's radically democratic, right? Tending toward, if not consensus, and it has redivided itself. It has a division of labor in committee works. It has a GA that's directly democratic. This is not just Tea Party folks coming together for a rally, showing some guns, waving some flags, and then going home, right? There is no Tea Party education committee, food committee, 24/7 committee, foreclosure committee. There is no Tea Party GA. They're not the same. I have lots to say about the differences. Maybe we could talk about them later. So the idea here is that the Occupy movement actually represents an alternative, radically democratic political organization at the time when there's a legitimation crisis with representational democracy. And I think that's why people are so drawn to it. Even if you're not yet participating in it, notice it yet, not yet participating in it, you feel an affinity for it, you understand it. Right? Because somehow Occupy is doing something that representational government and capitalism is not. Okay, I'm going to skip over right now. On the handout I have the proximate or the immediate causes of the crisis. And I think let's talk about them in the discussion period. And that's the subprime mortgage crisis, different financial mechanisms that created systemic risk in the financial markets and brought the whole baby down, right? So we can talk about that. We can talk about underwater homes, et cetera, et cetera. I'd like to get a few more of the kind of basic theoretical, analytical points out, and then open it up, if that's all right with everybody. So I'd like to skip to the big question: what is capitalism? And I have here that there are 4 basic properties or qualities of capitalism. Some of you are very familiar with these things. Some of you maybe have not thought about this. So let me just read through them. The first is that the vast majority of the means of production And here I'm talking about factories, machinery, tools, offices, land. These are utilized to produce commodities, and they're privately owned by a small minority of the population. So the way we make things, right, the tools, literally, the factories, the buildings, everything is owned by a small minority of the population. That's the first point. The second point, the vast majority of people works for or sells their labor as a commodity to this small minority. The third point is that commodities produced are exchanged in a market system. Notice that this is the first time we're talking about markets even, right? Markets and capitalism are not synonymous. Capitalism utilizes markets, but they're not the same thing. Number 4, the immediate purpose of almost all production is profit through exchange rather than satisfying needs through use or consumption. This is critical. Almost everything that's produced in capitalism is produced by people who are not using what they're producing. They're producing on behalf of the owner for those things to be sold and make a profit. So this is why you get these strange, seemingly irrational conditions where you have millions of homes that are empty and millions of people who are homeless, right? Because those homes are not there to satisfy needs. They're on a market to make profit. You can't just go and use them because you have a need. You have to buy them or occupy them. If you come to the meeting tomorrow, we can talk more about that. Okay. Let me just talk. I'm not going to read, but I'm just going to talk about division of labor and inequality. We all know about a division of labor, right? Everything that's produced, almost everything. I mean, I'm not talking about growing fruit and vegetables and raising chickens in your yard and whatnot and satisfying immediately your needs, although that is a way of, in a sense, contrasting the division of labor. I'm talking about factories. I'm talking about service industries. I'm talking about almost every form of labor in contemporary society is divided. We're only doing part of the production process. And the way you increase efficiency of production is you further divide labor, ever more divide labor. So, because that's the most efficient way to do it. If I'm doing the same thing over and over and over and over rather than moving over there and doing this and then going over there and doing this and then traveling across the town and picking up that. If there's one person that's just doing travel, there's one person that's just doing pressing, there's another person that's doing assembly, right? It's more things get built. If more things get built in a less amount of time, less labor costs, more profit, right? So there's a built-in incentive to further divide labor. That means that almost all labor in contemporary society is social. Everything is socially and cooperatively produced, as opposed to ownership and appropriation, which is private. Almost all appropriation and ownership is private, individual, right? So you get a tension between the social kinds of production and the private forms of appropriation. So I'm just going to throw that out there. I'm going to leave that out there. Inequality. Inequality is interesting insofar as people are always saying, there's people complain about inequality, as they should, of course, but think that somehow we can reform things so that there's no inequality. But the thing about capitalism is capitalism only arises with inequality and must reproduce inequality. Necessarily so. It cannot be otherwise. You cannot have profit in a capitalist system if everyone owns the means of production, right? You won't have wages. You have to have some part of the population that owns things and the other population that has no choice but to work for them to survive. And the people that own things make more and more money. You have to have that inequality. What is the entire financial system? It's about lending money for interest to people who don't have it. So the people, the have-nots, pay more for money. Rent, right? We pay rent because we don't own. Someone owns and they extract rent. Those are the pillars of surplus value in capitalism. That's how profit is produced, through unequal starting points, and then they reproduce inequality. And in some industries, the more productive you are, the more inequality you produce. Move to neoliberalism. Let me just give a little five-minute spiel on neoliberalism, and then we'll open it up, okay? And that's where we're going to talk about private power. Okay, I'm not going to read the top part, but in a minute I'm going to go to the bullet points, just so we can nail down some specifics here. In general, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism, we are in a neoliberal era. We have been in a growing, increasingly neoliberal era for about 30 years. Now, if you look at the charts of rising inequality, it goes from about 30 years ago, where it just explodes and goes in two different directions, right? And that's where we get the constitution of that not just the 1%, but 0.01%. That's the effect of neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism? It is an ideology, a philosophy, a policy that says that the political, public policy should be subjugated or dictated by economic policy, which is another way of saying that private economic power should dictate the constitution of public or political power, and sometimes just eliminate it. You're seeing dramatic examples of this in Greece, in Italy, right, where you get basically bankers coming in and redoing the state to make it more amenable to investors, right, to the financial industry itself. So neoliberalism will put private property and private right above public well-being, above democracy, right, self-governance, the public good. That's the idea. So it's not just capitalism. It's not just the idea of those four principles of capitalism. It's that the state and all political power should be subservient to private wealth or private power, right, amassed by the 1%. Okay. So let me say one more thing about that. Neoliberalism thrives by destroying and uprooting any forms of community or solidarity, connectedness, anything like that. Why? Because it needs to create division. It needs to uproot anything that will prevent commodification, privatization, ways of life that might not be conducive to commodification in your neighborhood, in your city, in your state, like public parks, for example, or preservation of certain lands, even though there are minerals underneath it, right? Those are problems for neoliberalism, right? So you want to destroy any kind of communal, collective sense of belonging in order to be able to uproot those public things and make them private. Then you can put them in the circulation of value and rights in a capitalist system, and you can make money from them, right? Now, one part of this is also creating divisions along those intersectionalist lines I mentioned before, like race, gender, sexuality, etc. What does this do? Very quickly, it creates divisions within the 99%, where they are opposing each other and driving down wages, marginalizing groups from access to legal representation, social recognition, cultural expression, right? Making them work for less wages, making their positions precarious, right? On average, women, which is half the population, makes about, 13, 14% less than men across the board, right? That's profit. That is profit. So if you have patriarchy, you have more profit. If you have white supremacy, you have more profit, right? If some groups are excluded or marginalized, they will have to work for less wages. They will have less representation. They will have less power. Right? So one of the greatest threats to neoliberalism is solidarity, right? Is overcoming patriarchy, is overcoming white supremacy, is forming cohesive, self-reflective forms of community. That is a great threat. Okay, I just want to say, I want to do this little list here, and then I'll end, and then let's open it up for discussion, which is what neoliberalism actually believes. And by this I mean that there's no ideology, there's no misrepresentation. This is what they actually believe, advocates of neoliberalism, that economic profit should dictate public policy. Legitimate power is almost always private power. Economic freedom is more important than political freedom. Regulation is a usurpation of private power by the public. Taxation is a usurpation of private power by the public. It is, on its face, wrong, according to neoliberalism. Publicly owned and controlled resources should be privatized. So those are the true, authentic commitments of people subscribing to neoliberalism. Now, then what are the ideas that are projected about neoliberalism that I would say are false, and many of the advocates of them are disingenuous. They're saying these things as lies, as deceptions, as ways of trying to get us to commit to these ideas. And that's that markets are most efficient when unregulated. Profit is made despite the state rather than with state assistance. Unregulated markets encourage competition rather than monopolies. These are all false. Capitalists create value. Less taxation will produce more jobs through investment. We hear that so often, and it's bullshit. Solely pursuing private interests leads to public goods, and political and economic freedom are essentially related. Now, anyone who wants to look at China, the fastest growing capitalist economy in the world, which will take over probably in 15 to 20 years as the dominant economic power in the world, is getting less and less free in the register of political liberty and more capitalist. The conjunction or connection between political freedom and private property right was historical, not essential. And now we have all kinds of examples of their growing apart. Right. Okay, so I will leave it at that, and let's open it up for discussion.
I just wondered if you could speak to the defining neoliberalism in a more specific way. I think traditionally in the early part of the 20th century and probably up through the 60s, we referred to this as imperialism. But what was going on then was a process of nation building, so that politicians, economists, so forth, were involved in building the nation state. This goes up through, probably to the late 70s. In the late 70s, you have a huge shift that occurs where capital says, oh, well, we can go into other poorer countries and continue to get cheaper labor, so you have outsourcing, these sorts of things. So the nation state becomes less important for the capitalist system, and perhaps more capital then begins to disconsider anything about what would be good for the nation as such. I just like to speak to that.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And there are a few things I want to say about it. One is that you're exactly right, and you're exactly right about the time period. So let me just say about why then? Why 70s? What is it about the 70s that we start to get the development of neoliberal theory? When do we get Thatcher and Reagan? We get them just a few years. They represent the political kind of manifestation of this new neoliberal thinking. And the idea is that after World War II, so the U.S. is the superpower after World War II. All competitors are subjugated. We are dictating the terms of international trade. We are creating international financial institutions that, in a sense, magnify U.S. interests. But you also have things like the development of the middle class through the GI Bill and through mortgage companies. You have organized labor, which is exerting force. My father, uneducated, unskilled, was able to buy a small home as a worker in a car factory through organized labor. He was a member of a union, right? Now, that puts a hurdle to capitalist profit. So what do you do when you have nationally bound, organized labor putting up a barrier to profit? You start to create outsourcing. That's when you get the huge push to circumvent organized labor by outsourcing the countries that aren't organized, whose governments would love to take 50% of all of that capital flowing into the country, to not regulate, to not have any quality of life whatsoever. I mean, it's ridiculous how bad it was in the 70s. It's still terrible, but no regulation. Why? To get around those barriers to capital. Now, we do that, and then everyone starts doing it. It's the law of competition, right? If one company starts doing that, the other company has to do that, because one of the greatest, in almost every industry, one of the greatest inputs, most expensive inputs in production is labor. So if someone can get labor for 10 cents an hour and the other person's paying $20 an hour, we know who's going to win in that system, right? So then everyone starts exporting. And this is generating tremendous amounts of profit, and that profit is then going back to a long-term strategy funding think tanks, funding political training centers, basically, to infiltrate and get representatives of the neoliberal policy into government to, in a sense, dismantle government. We see this with the ALEC now, this American Legislative Exchange Council, where everyone is going after public sector unions. Teachers are evil. Garbage workers are evil. Because why? Because they're unionized, right? They're a barrier to capital accumulation. And so that destroyed the labor union movement in the United States. And that's different than imperialism. Imperialism is the appropriation and accumulation of wealth and resources through violent means. If you can set up financial institutions that will do it through contractual means, it's less money, it's greater stability, it's more profit. All right. Does that get to your